I'm Steven, and today I will be talking about vectorizing lettering. So, usually I'm a font designer, which means I draw letters to put into fonts and then build those fonts and space the letters and kern the letters, and it actually involves a lot of things. But ultimately, a lot of it is drawing letters. And specifically, I draw letters with vectors or Bézier curves. And the same tool can be used to draw lettering that makes it really useful in a lot of ways that it wouldn't necessarily be as just an image. So, as an example, I have this lettering that I want to vectorize. Um, I thought I would take you through kind of narrating how I actually draw over this lettering with the pen tool in a font editor that I like to get vector Bezier based artwork. And the whole reason to do this is that if you've got just like a scan of letters that you've drawn, you can do a lot with that. You could process it in Photoshop to make the title of a book cover or a poster. You could do something called auto tracing in Adobe Illustrator or other apps. And then it would be vectors that you could scale and do things with. The reason to have vectors is that they scale. So you could either make it super tiny, which you could do with an image, or you could make it extremely big. So you could put it on the side of a building, or you could feed it into a CNC laser cutter or CNC router to cut out of wood or cut out of vinyl, or there's a lot. And if you've wound up on this video, you probably know a lot of that already. So you might just be looking for tips and techniques of how I do the vectorization process. So first of all, I'll start out with the easy way, and then I'll kind of compare and contrast that to the hard way, the way that I'll be showing. And that may give you a bit of a sense of why you might do this and why you might not do this potentially. So first of all, I scanned some lettering. I did this on a piece of paper. I did it with a brush pen, sort of like this, but a black version of this style of brush pen. I did it in, I won't give the whole background because designing lettering is an entire other subject, really, but I did it in multiple stages. So I kind of sketched out ideas and I tried to do it with a brush. I'm not the best brush letterer or sign painter out there, so it actually took me multiple passes and kind of basically tracing my lettering. I can't exactly remember. I think I even kind of pencil traced and adjusted with pencils and erasers and such to get some lettering I liked. And then I went back over that and traced it with a brush to get something that I really liked the look of. So it was actually quite a bit of work to get something that looked really casual and easy. And by the way, this is a little sign I made for the corner of my apartment that is a bit messy. It's got skateboards and shoes and cardboard that has to be recycled and these things. So jokingly, my partner and I call it the garage because we don't have a garage. So I, did some very basic cleanup in Photoshop, just used a healing brush to get rid of some of the gross parts and scanner gunk and stuff. All right, so if I drag it into Adobe Illustrator, it'll load. And then, a typical way you might handle vectorization if you just want to do it really quick, and you've already done quite a bit of work to make the lettering a very strong contrasting black on white or white on black image, you can just drop an image in, and then you can say image trace, and it might proceed slowly with this large image. A tip is that you probably want to be tracing a large image to make it as detailed as possible. So honestly, this looks pretty good. This might be exactly what you're going for. And if that's the case, then you're basically done. You can say expand this, and now, delete the white shapes, and you might have to move it out here and delete some white shapes here, yeah. If you want to, I'm just going to Command Z to undo this a few times, because, okay. You can also, this isn't mostly a tutorial about Illustrator, but just to take you through the options, you do have options. If you click this little icon here next to the tracing result, you should have options. Maybe I have to undo a few more times. Yeah. So, there's different modes. You can even live trace or image trace like full color images, I think. And then I imagine, it might be one way to blow up an image onto a billboard or something, or to make t-shirt artwork. You could do a lot of things with it. But yeah, you can play with the like threshold, for instance, of this artwork. And if you set it higher, it'll try to capture more of the blacks. And if you set it lower, it'll capture more of the kind of whites. So with some maybe dry brush effects, that might be helpful. Now, a reason I don't personally love image trace, it depends on the artwork, first of all. Sometimes it's better than others. But for instance, like, I can just see it from a mile away, kind of, as somebody who's spent time with vectors and lettering. Like, this all just looks so robotic to me. It's just kind of a gross texture. And, it's not that I could code something better. It's technically very impressive that Illustrator could do this, I think. And, once you set your threshold to the right level, like, this, looks pretty good, actually. Looks pretty acceptable. And if I saw this laser cut into wood, I would probably think that was pretty cool already. But, if you're making a logo for a client, for instance, you might want to get a little more refined. You might want to get a little more detailed. If you're making a sign for a shop, you would probably, depending how you're making the sign, you might need to make it more detailed than this. Or you might just, again, want it to be more refined. So there's a whole other way you can do this. It's kind of the hard way now. You can use a font editor you could use Illustrator to draw this, but I don't recommend it. The Illustrator pen tool is pretty annoying. And once you draw in a font editor, you won't want to go back to drawing with the pen tool in Illustrator because font editors just have really nice pen tools. So this program is called Glyphs Mini, and it's a $30 version of the normal Glyphs app. Glyphs is a phenomenal app for drawing fonts. The main app is like around $300, I think, which is a lot, but it does a lot, and you can make full-fledged fonts in it with like lots of styles. It's a professional tool used by font designers and studios around the world. There are other great font design software, font editors. Like, I really love RoboFont. I've heard a lot of good things about FontLab. There are open source options if you really want to use free software. So FontForge is worth checking out as well. But yeah, I think if you're just getting into it, Glyphs Mini is an excellent option. It is Mac only, but like, it's got a great user experience and UI, and it does quite a bit of things very well. And then if you get more into it, Glyphs full version is very worthwhile, kind of as a next step. Yeah. So the way Glyphs works basically is that like, it has placeholder glyphs, and you can type them out. And, here we have ABC, the pen tool. I could draw the letter A with, and then A is drawn. And if I click down here, for instance, it shows me a quick small preview. It shows me that the contour direction, which matters, is different. So I have to like right click and reverse, and now it's overlapping as I want it to. A basic drawing thing to know is that like if you want a curve rather than a straight line, we have a little accidental curve here. You can get curves while you're drawing, but it's nicer usually to draw a bunch of straight segments and then option click on a segment. And then you can actually drag right from the middle of it to make it into a curve. So that's kind of a cool way to design letters. And already I think that's a thing that, don't quote me on this, but I think that's a sort of interaction that Illustrator pen tool and most pen tools don't have outside of font editors, but it's super useful for drawing a letter. So, right, like I'm not drawing the logo yet. How do I draw the logo? All right, there's a few steps. Basically, I'm saying that, you draw the alphabet here because when I'm doing lettering, I just like plop my image into a letter and start drawing it there. So let's grab our image again. I could use the vector from Illustrator actually, but I could also plop an image directly into it. So I've got a slightly smaller version here. Yeah, basically I'm going to hold shift and scale it up so that the image basically falls into my font metrics. This is the baseline. This is the cap height, or the top of the capitals. And I'm going to make this nice and big to fit it. However, something that may not be obvious to you if you're just getting into vectorizing letters is that when you draw a font, or any vectors really, you're working on a coordinate grid. And something like Illustrator covers this up pretty nicely, and you may not notice. But when you start to zoom in on a font editor, you'll quickly notice that you are drawing on a grid. So that's pretty helpful, really, because you can get very specific, and like that's ultimately what you're making. So it's nice to be able to draw on a grid. Another cool thing about font editing programs, by the way, is that you can like select these off curve handles that change the curve, and you can use your arrow keys to move them around. So that's very helpful, very essential. But yeah, you very likely will want a finer resolution grid if you are trying to draw lettering. So what you can do is in Glyphs, you can do File, Font Info, or Command I. And then it looks a little different in the full GlyphsApp versus Glyphs Mini, but this has all of what you need. First thing you're going to do is change your units per M, which is the coordinate grid you're drawing in. So you want more resolution. So honestly, usually I'd do like 10,000, for instance, for lettering. Maybe here it's a slightly smaller lettering composition, so I'll do 5,000. And then I just personally set my cap height to the top of that. And I tend to set the X height to the middle of it just for some sort of guide. The center height, I set it's the same as the cap height. It could be different in a font. I'm going to send the descender to 0, which is just the baseline. And this looks good. So if we go back here, we see all of a sudden our drawing area is way bigger and our basic image is way smaller. It's just 1,000 or about 1,000 units, and now our drawing space is 5,000. So we just got to scale it up. Yeah, and it doesn't matter if you're doing lettering precisely where you put it. It just has to be wide enough. So yeah, that's a pretty good start. Now, I am going to say something that I don't know why I'm hesitating like this. Basically, I tried to make this video before and I got a little ways into it and then realized I had an issue with my webcam, so I had to throw that take away. But it does mean that I have already drawn out the word the to a fairly decent level. So here's where I got before. And actually, one thing that this allows us to do, I can just like Command A to select all, copy with Command C. Let's go back to Illustrator and we can directly compare these two things. So like for instance, I'll expand it and I'm going to delete this or move it out of the way, I guess. And then I'll paste this. It's way bigger because the coordinate grid we were working on was pretty big, but we can scale it because it's vectors. That's pretty cool. And this is kind of a good side-by-side comparison of like the approximate effect you can get by drawing vectors specifically versus auto tracing them. And you know, these are both pretty nice images. Like one is not necessarily better than the other or worse than the other. They're just different. So this to me would make a better logo in most cases, unless you really want a grungy effect, in which case maybe this would work a little better. This I would say works a little better for like scaling down because it's not too complicated. It also, I think, looks better scaled up because it's a more purposeful set of curves. And I'm not saying it's perfect yet. I still want to go back and improve upon it. But yeah, I mean, obviously, depending on your aesthetic preferences and your specific project, you'll end up preferring one or the other. But this is kind of a preview of what I'll be continuing to draw. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm not going to try to repeat this work because that'd be pointless. So let me look at the font info. Okay, I was drawing at 5,000 UPM before as well. So I can just copy this into my other font. So let's find that. Here it is. And because this one is also a UPM 5000, it should paste with no problems. Yeah, pretty much the exact scale, or really, yeah, pretty much the exact scale I want. I'll also, maybe I can copy the image. I maybe have to unlock it somehow. Is there, sometimes nope. Well, maybe I cannot unlock the image. All right, so, oh, was that? Okay, there it is. All right, so I could unlock the image. So I'm also going to paste that over just so I have the exact same scaling. Well, that didn't work. I mean, okay, so this scaling looks super close. I think I'll just like let it be because it looks very close. I think I just kind of like nailed it without intending to. I'm also going to save this real quick. Garage lettering, you know, obviously a good thing to, obviously a good thing to get in the habit of saving early and often when you're making files that take a lot of work and time. Because I mean, Glyphs does a pretty good job of like making backups for you, but it's never a nice thing to have a program crash for some reason or your computer crash and realize that you may not have saved. So do this. And all right, what the heck? Maybe I have to lock the image again. I'll do this and then I'll save it. So, or rather, I'll explain it. So as I mentioned earlier, option click in the middle of a path to add these off curve points, and then you drag the path to where you want it to be. So very often I will start out a drawing by clicking where I think I want my main anchor points or like on curve points to be. And then I'll go back through and add curves. So it can be a slightly faster way to work. Because you really do, there are like a few rules for how you will tend to set out your points. I'm also going to make these smooth points. I'll select it and click return, and then I'll select the node and nudge it. And if this is a smooth point, the other side will snap into place. Okay. And yep. To explain the placement of points, you need to know about extrema. So extrema are the locations that are the extreme left, right, top, and bottom of a Bézier contour or a shape. And you pretty much always want points to be at the extrema. Part of this comes from fonts. They tend to render better if there are points at the extrema, because if a glyph is really small, pixels, like the computer basically has to decide what pixels to fill with that shape. And it's just better at making that calculation if there are like definite defined vertical and horizontal bounds. But even when you're lettering, it's really useful to have extrema set, because that makes it easier to draw, basically. It just kind of gives you like a starting point that's, you can think through like what is a good minimum amount of points that I need to draw a shape. And that will vary based on the complexity of drawing you want, how smooth you want your curves to be. And then also just because font editing programs and computers in general, I guess, are kind of built assuming that a lot of angles are going to be right angles, things will snap to basically horizontal and vertical lines. So putting your points at extrema will just make it way easier to kind of set out and start controlling your points. There are other ways to do this, like, if you really want an angled point, in glyphs at least, if you hold Option and then you, for instance, drag a point or a segment or a point, it will stay on its like diagonal path. So that's extremely useful too. Usually I do use that by clicking in the middle of a segment and holding Option while I'm basically like pulling the segment around to adjust both points at once. So yeah, this is a bit of an interesting shape with a brush. I'm like not, as you can tell, not totally wanting to keep that exact shape in the final vectored lettering. I'll probably like come back to it in a second pass. But for now, let's talk slightly less and draw a little more, so that I can explain a couple more concepts. So one thing you might be noticing is that I'm not drawing this whole letter in one pass. I have actually kind of taken the stroke logic of the lettering, and this was drawn with a brush. So like you can probably imagine, like I did this stroke and then that stroke and this one and that one and that one and that one. If you're drawing brush lettering specifically with vectors, and then to a varying degree other types of letters, it can be extremely useful to draw it as separate strokes, because you're just really mirroring the logic that was used to draw the thing. And it just kind of works out really nicely with Bézier curves when you do that. It makes it easy to think about, I suppose, is half the benefit. But then also just easy to like edit and draw, because you get to think of like how this curve will be and how this curve will be without having to make decisions about how these like adjacent curves will be. So that's pretty useful. Making some smooth points. Okay, that looks pretty all right to me. I'm using P shortcut to like the arrow key, what the keyboard key, the letter P to get my pen tool. Sometimes it's hard to think and draw. Here's another circumstance where I'm not yet sure whether I will keep my like how close I'll adhere to the lettering. This looks a little odd with vectors. We'll see. So, by the way, you click to add the curve, and then you can drag the curve. I don't know if I explained this very well, but Glyphs Mini is a pretty cool program in that like it has basically the full set of drawing tools as the full featured glyphs. I'm not sure whether you can get extensions for it, which is actually, that's a pretty huge benefit to the full featured glyphs. Kind of a bummer that they don't have them here. But even so, like this is a superb drawing tool. And if you're getting started in drawing fonts and letters, honestly, it's certainly not essential and maybe not necessarily helpful to have to immediately jump into thinking about extensions because there's so many important aspects to drawing letters well. Extensions could definitely kind of muddy the waters. All right, so we've got almost a G. And by the way, you don't have to draw with all straight points. You can kind of rough out your shape by dragging as you draw. It's just sometimes it works better than others. So I don't always do it. Probably if you figured out super well, you could get really fast though. So that would be a benefit. But speed at immediate drawing isn't always the most important aspect of drawing letters. It's much more about your ability to refine the shapes once you have them drawn and your eye, basically. That's a thing that people develop for years. And I'm still very much working on. Something good to know about then starting to refine these curves is that often a goal in type design or Bézier drawing is to get smooth curves that you're drawing with. So kind of to simplify this, I like drawing a circle, and let's make the B a lot wider. Oops. So I like to draw a circle. I said wider. And let's make the C wider so it goes away. Oh, we could also just remove it from our editing view. All right, so a circle. This is a circle, more or less. You'll notice that this segment has 2 on curve points and 2 off curve points. And when it is a smoothly drawn segment, the on curve points will tend to be parallel, or the off curve points will tend to be parallel to the on curve points. So you can see that if I draw a guide between these on curves and then a separate guide between these off curves, they are parallel. A thing I learned recently is that people sometimes refer to this as a frog. And if you've got just one segment here, oh, that didn't work. You can delete a section by selecting some points and then clicking Option Delete. All right, so say I've got a single segment here. You might think of it as a frog because it's basically got a big mouth and then 2 eyeballs. And a further metaphor I learned is that if you've got a smooth curve where these things are parallel, people will call it a sober frog. And if you've got a non-smooth, well, this is actually still smooth because they're still parallel. It's just like an italic frog at this point. All right, so let me hold Option. Okay, now you've got a bit of a wonky curve that will tend to look odd in a shape. And this you might consider a drunken frog because it's got its eyes like way out of line with its mouth. A second kind of general no-no is crisscrossing your handles. So if they overlap, you kind of start to lose control of the path. Usually you want them to like have an imaginary triangle that goes out. So that's a lot of Bézier theory. Let's keep drawing. I'm actually going to draw here for a bit, and I will time lapse that. And then I'll, slow it down to make comments or make some comments towards the end when we start to refine it again. And I'm just popping in here literally the next day to refine some of these time-lapse sections. And that's, maybe I'll say something useful, but really I just don't want to find royalty-free music. Okay, so here's a moment where it might be worth slowing down again. I just drew the A and the R, and, if this were a font, the A would just pretty much repeat, with a few exceptions where maybe it wouldn't repeat. But because this is lettering, the next A does have a different shape, and it's intended to have a different shape. But because we're drawing with vectors and the shape is relatively similar, it is still useful to, double click to select this contour, double click this one, double click this one, and then Command C, Command V to copy and paste, and then we can move it over here. And this gives us, not the exact shape we want, but pretty much the starter point structure that we want. And that saves me some clicking around. It also provides a really good example of a feature I really love about font editors. It's called a scaling edit feature. So if I move this point, it will move independently. And like the curve, basically, if I move this point, it looks bad this way or it looks bad this way. So it's not that useful. But if I hold Control Option in Glyphs, it will give me a scaling edit. And basically that scales the other parts of this curve, like this handle here and this handle here, so that they continue to look pretty okay, like the right same kind of curvature as I move this one around. That's incredibly powerful. It like really, really speeds things up. So like for instance, I just want to nudge this over here. So Command or Control and Option and scaling edit it. And yeah, it's pretty much there. Glyphs has a particularly good scaling edit where like it does a little more than some other programs, because like see how this handle or off curve, it actually like changes angle as this one moves up. that is better than the scaling edit in RoboFont. So it's pretty nice. I don't know if FontLab has, I'm sure it has some sort of scaling edit. I don't know if it has this style or another style. RoboFont's still awesome to draw on. I didn't mean that as any shade against it. This is just one of the things that I genuinely appreciate about Glyphs, and like an example of how it's a really stellar drawing program. All right, so you might notice that I'm scaling editing multiple things here. It's like a great feature. Another thing that I didn't really highlight when I was drawing the G that is really worth highlighting in this style in particular is that there's a concept of inflected curves in Bézier drawing. And like, let's copy this to its own glyph. We'll set down our B again. Let's delete these guys real quick. So this is an ordinary curve. Most of the time, traditionally, you don't want to surpass really 90 degrees difference in this style of like a cubic curve, as this is technically called. You don't want to go beyond 90 degrees very much because you start to lose control when it's like this. You also don't want an inflected curve, traditionally speaking, where if you imagine driving on a road in this shape, you start by turning right, and then you kind of straighten out, and then eventually you start turning left. So there's one point here, like nowhere on this is actually straight, and it'll be more clear if we make it really pronounced. So this is still an inflected curve, but yeah, so you're turning right, and then eventually you're turning left. The inflection point is where the curvature changes direction, and typically font designers would want to add an extra point there, so you have more control over how this curve should be. However, even though that can be very useful for especially drawing something like the capital letter S, the spine of it can be, you know, you want to get really particular about it. I find that in drawing brush lettering and a lot of other tricky shapes, inflected curves are amazingly useful because it's going to be pretty smooth, and as long as you can approximately fit the curve, it keeps your shapes really simple. And as an added benefit, if you start to get a little further into drawing type, when you're interpolating, as it's called, going from bold drawings to light drawings to generate the intermediate weights, this is a technique used in variable font design a lot. Inflected curves just work. They just interpolate well. They don't have kinks in the middle. Whereas if you have that extra point here, you have to get pretty careful about it to not have it kink in the interpolations. So that's not fun. I'm going to, oops. Okay, thing I don't like about glyphs is that it's too easy to select off curve points when you don't want to. That is kind of a nitpick, but kind of annoys me sometimes. All right, so yeah. You could also see right here, like I did kind of follow the brush a little more, whereas like down here I didn't. I'm still sort of figuring out if I want these sharp sort of scalloped bits or if I want those to all be inflected curves. I'll probably make a couple of options at the end and then decide when I'm sort of able to see the two options next to one another. So I'm going to speed this up again and do another time lapse so I can actually finish the drawing. Okay, folks, next day, Stephen back again. Here I am once again time lapsing. So this is a little bit of a quicker look at how I do drawing. Here's a big inflected portion of a letter and then connecting that lower hook and drawing another E just real quickly. yeah, something I learned here is that like it is pretty good for drawing quite quickly. Once you figure it out, you don't have to set your start points and then go back and make the curves. You can kind of more quickly rough things out once you figure out the hotkeys. So the main thing is that like if you are making a sharp corner, I'll just draw an example here. If you're making a hard corner, if you're making a smooth point, you just kind of draw around and just drag in the direction you want to go. However, if you're making a sharp corner, let's draw a smooth, and then let's do like a sharp. If I hold Option, I can just kind of drag out from this path, and then my point will be there. So I don't know if that, like, it's something you have to kind of do to understand, but it's pretty nice once you start figuring that out. You can get pretty fluent in drawing in glyphs, so it's a cool feeling, gotta say. This is a nice example where I've got basically an extrema and then basically the next point, but it's looking a little smoother and I want it to look a little more square. So I'm just going to add a point at this location at kind of an angle, and then I'll use Option to kind of like drag my points, and basically this extra point here just gives me the option to make that a little more squared off, sort of a little more like it was when it was drawn with the brush. Another thing I like to mention is that the transform tools in font editors are like hugely powerful and really easy to overlook. So I love grabbing like a whole point along with its off curves and then using these handles to transform it, and like it's just a different sort of, it's kind of like an extra level of complexity figuring out how to draw like that. But yeah, like some of the time it's just helpful to draw like that. Of course, like another big thing that I didn't really talk about but is very worth getting to know is drawing using the arrow keys to nudge what you have selected, and shift to make bigger nudges, and I think, yeah, shift command to make really big nudges. It's very useful just to be able to nudge things around. Even more so, I would say, in drawing type usually than drawing maybe lettering like this. But yeah, like as you could see, there were various examples in there where some big nudges were very helpful. All right, we're getting almost done with our rough draft. There's a nice example of where I wanted to change my angle a little bit. You can kind of see me hunting for these extrema, yeah, as I go. And yeah, a cool thing about glyphs is that down here there's like a little preview you can get or dismiss by clicking that eyeball. That's kind of useful. I'm guessing that on the video, if you've got sort of lower render settings, unfortunately these like strokes are very fine lines, kind of to reinforce the notion that you're making very specific decisions about your shapes, but it can probably be hard to see in a screen recording like this. This is kind of a nice example where like a Drunken frog actually works pretty well for the curve that I have there. And I don't think I'm going to go back and smooth it out. Like, because if I smooth it out, you can see I'm actually really missing the actual curve that's there. Whereas If I allow one of the off curves to be way longer, it just like fits it better. So, you know, you can use your judgment on things like that. Yeah. So like, final thing I want to do here is kind of figure out, you know, all right, so I just like go back and clean up some of the weird looking spots. So this is a weird spot here because it's like way too fine a detail. And I basically want to think about how I might draw that in a way that like makes the white space here a little bigger and more deliberate. So that's kind of doing it already. Here I'm using that transform method again. Yeah, so that's, I think, big enough to be like, you know, an actual detail. Yeah, I will probably go back through and clean this up more. Like one thing you could do is at this stage, you could print it on an actual sheet of paper if you've got a printer, and then sort of trace and draw over that with how you want to fix it. Because like when you draw something with a brush, like your eye kind of forgives it for any sort of, why are my panels all mixed around again? Your eye is very forgiving, essentially, if you're looking at something that was clearly made by like a hand tool. But your eye becomes real judgy when you start to see something in really defined, hard black and white lines like this. So yeah, it can be worth kind of cycling on it a few times to really get it to be something that looks great. And this is a pretty elusive aspect of it. Like, how do you get from something that looks pretty good to something that looks great? A lot of it is about kind of studying the greats, like finding people that really inspire you, that draw really well, and especially that draw well with vectors, and kind of just really looking at how they do things. So, you know, kind of the gold standard maybe is Ken Barber at House Industries. He's done amazing brush lettering drawing. Jen Ramirez is one of a former classmate of mine from Type Media. He's really phenomenal as a sign painter and as somebody who draws well with vectors. James Edmondson of Oh No Type is really incredible. He's got some great brush lettering fonts. There's like a bunch of people that are just really great, and you can find them on Instagram, of course. And just, yeah, take a good look at what they draw like. But then, yeah, it's also about like just kind of like finding, this sounds cheesy, finding your own voice and finding like the decisions you think work well. So part of that is just about like putting in the time and drawing a lot. And the more, like, drawing is a very difficult skill to really get great at. So the more you do it, the more fluent you'll be about it. In particular, the better you'll be about knowing what you want, which makes it easier to draw. And then, of course, knowing how to get what you want with vectors is another kind of a challenging aspect. At first, when I was drawing with vectors, I felt very awkward. And now I feel pretty natural about it. Like, I can manipulate the paths fairly well. So like if I see that it looks a little thinner down here than up here, like I know that I can move this node a little bit to correct that. I can move this handle a bit to correct that. And it starts to look more kind of what I think it should look like. Another thing, of course, is that like as I'm going through this, I sometimes make different versions, which is a pretty cool aspect of working in a type editor or font editor. You can just like copy and paste from glyph to glyph. So that's one really kind of quick, easy way to like make some edits and then make some more edits, make some more, and then like be able to say like, what's, I mean, these are the same right now, but what is A versus B looking like? And like now that B doesn't have any image behind it, I can really clearly see what I'm doing. Another thing I could do would be to like copy it. If I do Command B, I can go to the background layer and paste it. And now this has like a fainter image behind it. So I don't know if this is useful here, but like here I can see exactly how my adjustments on the foreground layer are changing it versus the background layer. So that is pretty cool. I think you can even add a component that is referencing like a foreground layer, which is a thing somewhat specific to glyphs, but is pretty cool and potentially very helpful. Yeah, so like now if I go ahead and make a change over here, I'll see it immediately in the background image on here. So that's just really neat. Yeah, there's like, of course, you know, thousands of things that could be said for how to do this. Glyphs has some really great documentation on glyphsapp.com. So if you are getting into it, I definitely suggest going there and trying to read the documentation. That's kind of true for any font editor, but in particular, like Glyphs and RoboFont. Like RoboFont does it really well as well. But they just have like really great documentation. You can learn so much from just reading it, like literally like going, and I think they've even got like, you know, they've got it organized where there's a start here, and it's also pretty easy to search for specific information once you know what you want to find. It's really well put together. And then there's forums where you can go and ask for help when there's something you run into that you really are specifically unsure about. So that can be pretty nice. I mean, it can be pretty nice. That is super nice. That's how I learned like almost everything. Just like reading, Googling, complaining on forum, well, requesting help on forums when something's not working as I expect it to. Yeah, I could keep going for quite a while here. That is the fun and terrible thing about drawing with Bézier. Like you can get really, really picky. And honestly, like I think I'll stop here because I like how this looks. I would love to see this as, you know, I would think this would look pretty cool if it were printed with a CNC cutter or something. If I were going to prepare that, by the way, like I would probably copy and paste it over into Illustrator. And then you can see we have all of these like separate paths for like that we drew with drawing our brush strokes. So there's pretty easy ways to deal with that. If you know Illustrator, you know this, but yeah, you can do like, this is the Pathfinder tool, and then this is the like Unite option. And now all of these paths are single paths. And so you could do fun things like adding a gradient to them or printing them on a CNC tool or whatever else you want to try. So yeah, interestingly, because like a lot of these are drawn together. To make them one shape, you do object, compound path make, which is Command 8. Yeah, so now we have a single path that we can do cool things with, including print out in cool ways. All right, so I'm coming back to this the next day, and lettering is tricky because it's the kind of thing you could endlessly refine and keep iterating on, and eventually you just have to say it's good enough. But it's also useful to come back a day later or a few days later and look at something with fresh eyes. So when I look at this with fresh eyes, I see a few things that I do want to maybe try to tweak and play with. And I will do that quickly here just to show you how I would approach that stage of it. So I'm going to copy and paste this into my C glyph. First, I click in front of that and I change it to, I forget if it must have been 10,000. All right. Oops. And yep. Okay, so the things I wanted to fix, I mean, there's a number of things I want to test. The thing that stands out to me most of all, actually, though, is that this stroke on the G, it does actually follow how the brush pen drew it, but it's quite a bit sharper in this corner than kind of almost any of these other similar corners. So that's one thing that I'll smooth out a little bit. I also want to maybe just, I like most of it. I'm probably going to like pull this E up slightly to better follow the slope here. And probably in one more glyph, I will sort of smooth out some of these portions that are disconnected brush strokes. Like right now, this is showing a lot of brush overlap, as if it were the original brush drawing. I do like that here actually, but I also maybe want to take a look at, just for comparison sake, how it might look if these are smoothed out. I once had a friend look at these and be like, why are there a bunch of butt cracks in the letters? And that was a phenomenal misunderstanding of what the shapes were. Which I find pretty funny, but it's nice to think about the ways in which people might see your design differently than you do. So anyway, I'll do the first portion, just moving this E up a little bit. Let me really view, oh, this is fun. We can see all three together. Let me view this. In fact, I don't want to see all three together. I just want to work on this current version for a minute. Okay. So I'm going to pop that up a little bit to better follow the slope here. And in fact, while I'm at it, I think I might see if I can better visually center the entire word, basically. Like I feel like the word "the" was maybe slightly off center. And it's hard to get it perfect, but I think that's a little better. Once again, I think we need to boost up this E just a little bit. Okay. Yeah, oops. One of these points is not following, so let's grab that as well. Okay. Once we do that, we somewhat have to move this up slightly. I'm going to use Control Option while I do it and Shift just to kind of do that scaling edit mode again. All right, so that looks pretty good. I wanted to make this a little smoother here, so I'm going to hold Option and drag that. And I'm going to hold Option and drag this down slightly. You know what? I don't want to change the kind of thickness of this stroke. So I'm going to copy this, Command B to go to the background, paste it. And now if I slide this around, I can see exactly how it's changing in relation to the prior stroke. So I do like it, say, better up here, but not down here. And this is one of those cases where a little like transform box can be helpful, I think. Sometimes Glyph snaps a little more than I want it to. All right, that's pretty good. Let's see how that looks. Let's see how it looks versus the previous one. I don't know which one of these to look at. That's funny. Let me put that down. Yeah, I mean, they're pretty darn similar, of course. This could even get a little more sloped. Like, I think, well, let's just, so you can also duplicate in Glyphs just with Command D, and it just makes like a .001. I don't know. Different ways to get the same thing. The main thing is that you probably want one or the other system, just so you remember how to type it. If you are going to type a specific one, like C.001, you can do Command F to basically, wait, I think so. Maybe it's slightly different in, that's weird. Might be slightly different in Glyphs Mini. Very obnoxious. Okay. Well then, in Glyphs Mini, I recommend pasting to, say, the letter D, or the next letter over, rather than doing this alternate creation thing. I'm going to move this up slightly. And then I'm going to... You can also see here that the letter D has a slightly different strategy. So like here I've got the extrema, vertical, and then here I've got a angled. And the reason I'm doing angled is because this is shooting down in a longer way, and it felt just more natural to follow that curve like this. But it has its trade-offs, and potentially if I add an extreme, it may or may not give me a easier way to control that and make it similar. Yeah, I don't know. I'm holding Option Shift there. Yeah, it needs it. In this case, you can't do a curve like this with just 2 points, so it does need something here. But maybe I'll put it like over here, kind of more in the middle of the path. And then up here again. I do want to see what I'm doing in all black below. And sometimes I'll literally like edit my shape, but be watching the changes in the preview here so I can better. That's a weird thing to get used to, but it's a little bit useful to be able to really see what you're doing as you're doing it. How does this compare? This one is still quite a bit of a different angle than A. So maybe that sort of thing fits in with the overall sense of angles a little better on top, but then this still looks a little funky down below. Okay. Yeah, I think I like that. I mean, this sort of shows me that like the stems of these letters are pretty consistent, and then this one is a little bit more backslanted, essentially, for better and worse, perhaps. What if we try to angle it a little more? This is where potentially things go way off the rails when you start to try to basically draw entirely in Béziers. It's very hard to do well. Often it is a better strategy to just like pull something back into paper or like an iPad and Procreate so you can draw a thing in a more intuitive way, because like half of drawing with Béziers is just wrestling essentially to get the shapes that you want, but it's hard to sort of play in a way to get the shapes you want while you're doing the wrestling thing. It's like we've spent our whole life making even if you're not like an expert artist, you've spent a long time drawing or making marks, at least with like pen-like tools or pencil-like tools. And so this is unnatural enough, unless you're like Tobias Frere Jones or something, or somebody who's really drawn thousands of hours of type. It can be unnatural enough to draw like this where maybe it's not super productive. And yet here I am pressing on anyway. Yeah, I think I do like that better. Like, let's compare it to B. I don't know. I'm seeing the merit of this sharp bit. Okay, the last thing I want to do is get rid of these butt cracks and see what that looks like, and then we can compare and contrast that. Let's see, how might we even do this? I mean, at this point, the best way to remove those is probably to remove overlap in some of our separate brush strokes, almost making them single brush strokes. So let's be a little bit strategic about that. Like, I want to keep sharp angles, essentially. This could be an overlap, but this area where how do I even it's hard to articulate what I'm even saying, where there's like an overlap that is quite smooth. I'll probably try to remove overlap. Where is this? Remove. I only want to remove overlap on selected contours. Will this do it everywhere? Oh, great. That's not super helpful because I want to keep some overlap to have flexibility for spacing and things. I think this is the case where the knife tool might come in handy. So let's slice here and here where there are these overlapping contours. And then I'll get back to V. I'll select this area of overlap, hold Option, and then delete. That deleted a little more than I wanted to because this is selected, I guess. All right, let's just see if we can delete just the insides. Okay, that's looking better. And then these aren't yet connected, so you've got to like nudge them essentially, maybe. Okay, now it's, yeah, when you've got a bunch of points stacked, it's useful, but can be difficult to simplify the paths. And you don't want a bunch of extra points lurking. Oh, here's another thing. We should copy this to the background so we have some guidance for our stroke overlapping. So this already is a preview where instead of two separate strokes, it looks like one really fast brush stroke. Kind of a cool look. And then here we can take a slightly different strategy where like this, let's just bring it to there. And yeah, that's a lot faster on that part. Maybe we can do a similar thing here, basically. Yep. Cool. And we can just basically be roughing this out, honestly, for now. I'm holding Command Option a lot as I move these things to be not too disruptive to adjacent curves. Oh yeah, maybe this is, rather than trying to like remove this area of overlap, we could just literally pull this all the way down and then match there. And then maybe I'll make sure that this isn't doing some weird thing. Oops, that was not the E I intended, but similar thing can be done up here. And I'm just going back and forth between like the T button to see it, and then you can double click in, or the escape button will get you back to this editing. Nice big. See, I don't. That one's a little harder. I feel like just doing it like this, like, it's not quite doing it for me. I feel like it kind of needs to be a slightly bigger alteration. So for instance, I think this needs to maybe be a little more down here. And then maybe we do need to do this slicey thing to kind of be more in the middle. And do this here. One thing that Glyphs is really great at is like if you've got a point on a path and you delete that path, it's usually quite good at like matching the path to the simplified, or like without that point. It's really clever about keeping the shape you want even when you're simplifying path structure, which is really a cool thing. Very handy. Something like simplifying paths is not as fun in almost any other tool. So sometimes I've literally, like, if I've got to simplify paths, even if I'm primarily drawing a font in another font editor, I will bring it over to Glyphs just for that simplification step because it's so good at it. Yeah, that looks pretty cool. All right, trimming down these butts. Bet you didn't think this would be the tutorial for that. Yeah. Oops, not the one I wanted to change. Oh. All right, this needs to be a non-smooth point to make that work well. We don't need this point. Okay, so here's like probably a good overlapping shape approach. Rather than completely removing overlaps, we can take more of this kind of strategy. And this is probably sort of a template, or almost like a strategy for making shapes that will work, I think. When I'm drawing a new style of type or lettering, I'm like, part of it is searching for the styles of shapes or drawing that will allow me to achieve an aesthetic I want. Like it's not always the same for, you know, if I was drawing a classical serif typeface or a geometric sans serif typeface, like the approach, I would still use things like extrema, and there are strategies that basically work across the board. Oh. But at the same time, different styles of letters just do require slightly different kind of motifs in the way that you're drawing. So you can even kind of see that in how I've been approaching sort of this smoother script style versus the more brushy style. Oh, that doesn't look good. Let's pull that back a lot. I'm really really abusing inflected curves in a few of these places, but it pretty much is working. And probably should have done a time lapse by now, but I'm so close. At least I feel very close to having a rough at least. Let's see, getting there, getting there. Oh, that didn't work. Okay. This is a bit of a tricky one. I guess I'll drag this guy down. That looks terrible. So I really have to adjust this approach a little bit. Maybe I will once again abuse an inflected curve here. See what that does. No, it looks bad. All right, let's try this again. Wow. Okay, that finally looks pretty much okay. This kind of needs to be, I feel like the inside needs to be a little sharper if the bottom comes down like that. Yeah, because I still want some basically sense of drama and contrast. Like the suggestion of a brush really like kind of applying pressure differently. Kind of gracefully. This needs a little more contrast here. Just in that joint to match essentially this and this. These structures. Okay, we're super close. That doesn't need to be there, I don't think. Nice. Okay, so now, one more. Why does that look so off? Okay, maybe that's a little better. I kind of like that. So here is the more brushy style, and here is a more cleaned up style. Oh, I should obviously, I think, make these portions basically smooth as well. If I'm not doing the brushy overlaps, I don't think I need to keep these sort of deliberately brushy bits here either. I think a extrema had been added without me really wanting it to be at some point there. Maybe I'll move this like that. Okay. Okay, so that's looking pretty cool. You can probably start to understand what I mean by endless fiddling. The last thing I'm tempted to do would be to basically add in ink traps. You may or may not be familiar with that term. They've perhaps more aptly been called little flat bits. I think maybe that's a Klim type coinage for his pitch typeface, which is a super cool one. But essentially, a lot of typefaces will have little squared off or cut off bits where there are really acute angles, especially of white space. And I'm a sucker for that. I feel like it really just kind of makes it feel like properly digital or something. And there's something about it where this is a very sharp intersection when it's two vectors, and it's almost like it infinitely continues to be sharp. Or another way to say it is that it's just not like, there's no decision about where this stops. It just kind of stops. So if we add ink traps or little flat bits, we have a chance to actually sort of make more of a statement about how that ends. So there's different ways we could do this. We could just decide to scrap our overlaps entirely and then do some quicker cuts. And that's a pretty fast way to work. Or we could do a slightly different thing. And I'll probably do that just so I can retain flexibility like that. This is a little flat bit. I'll probably do stuff to retain my flexibility. I feel like it's usually a good strategy because it's hard to go back if you have ditched your flexibility, basically, if that makes sense. Yeah, it just, I don't know. I'm sort of, you know, emulating others a little bit when I do this stuff, but I think it just looks kind of right in a way. Of course, it's a whole other challenge, really, to determine which aspects now should get these little flat bits and which shouldn't. So that's kind of an interesting kind of question. Like, potentially this should actually be sharp here, but blunted here, or vice versa. I usually try to basically follow the idea that if a point is really acute, it should definitely get a flat bit. And if it's almost 90 degrees or less than 90 or obtuse, then it definitely doesn't need it. And then, yeah, there are just little questions here. And the reason I hesitate to do it on both sides is that it kind of looks a little bit silly to me to have two little ink traps that are abutting just like that. So maybe instead, the right solution is to just make that less prominent of an angle by a little bit. Or a less acute angle, rather. I don't know. I want to keep some of the contrast though. Yeah, this is where lettering really can show itself to be like a strange compulsion or something, maybe. Because you just want to keep on trying different things, right? Like, just to keep trying to like iterate on the idea and see all of the ways that it could be different or interesting or whatever. Oops. So I think I'll only do it for the word the, because quite frankly, I have other work I should be doing today. So I might come back to this later. You know, I'll do the thing where I come back with fresh eyes, and it won't ultimately take that long to add these flat bits, but of course it might take a long time to like really feel like, really feel like they are exactly what I want. And that's the thing that can take a long time. So I don't know. Yeah, that's how you can approach a couple of stylistic variations. Oh man, I really do like how they look. I'm a sucker for that drawing approach. I think this looks like decisive in a way that this doesn't. Like, this looks like it's approximating brush strokes with tracing. This is just a closer approximation. And then this is more like it's taking the idea but moving it into a digital realm. I don't know. I think there's like something really nice about that idea. It's like true to its nature. But yeah. The workday must commence. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you got something out of this. If you managed to sit through the whole thing, you, my friend, might be a type designer because you have a lot of patience. Yeah, if you're doing some lettering, good luck out there. If you have questions, let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe. I'm also on Instagram and Twitter, and I sell fonts. So if you like my fonts, maybe pick something up. Thanks so much. Have a good one.